guys, my name is Peng Yao and you're watching a guest build video for fellow YouTube content creator Stegar. Now Stegar has asked me to build an abandoned factory for his city Fairview and given me this plot, and it's quite a reasonable sized area. And before we get into the time lapse for the build proper, I'm just going to briefly touch on my kind of initial thoughts and some of my inspiration for this abandoned factory. So the first thing I did is just look online at some kind of images that caught my imagination. As you can see here, these are the type of things that I'm kind of going for, particularly the image on the left there with the collapsed roof structure there. So just generally trying to work out in my head what I'm going to do. These are some sketches, just concept sketches for the abandoned factory. And once I had those pretty much in my head, I started to then collect together some assets. So all my assets for the project are there on the side of the build. I'm trying to be a little bit more organized with these guest builds because there is a bit more kind of pressure there. You need to make sure that you're fairly you kind of get your assets and you try and stick to those, and also if you can try and create a Steam Workshop collection for the assets that you use, that is also really helpful, because then as soon as you move your export your project, hopefully the person at the other end can easily download or subscribe to those assets that they don't have. So I'm trying to be a little bit more efficient, and also just trying to pick assets that I think will work well, props that I think will kind of fit the build, and obviously getting together sort of a few buildings here and there that I think work with my idea. So basically the plan is, obviously it's an abandoned factory, so I needed to make sure that I'm using assets and things that give it the appearance of this being an abandoned structure. And that's not necessarily straightforward, because a lot of these assets are kind of like working warehouses and things like that. So I had to try to add certain details to them, let's say, just to give it a sense of it being now an abandoned area. And that really comes together towards the end of the build, once you start adding in those little details, things like decals, things like rubbish, and just generally bits and bobs that then kind of stop it from just looking like a normal industrial area, and really give it the sense of it being a kind of an old abandoned factory. So it's quite an art, I think, to try and get that effect well. And although I had those sort of images in my head of what I wanted, it was a little bit of a struggle initially just to work out how I was going to go about doing that. The first thing I did is I put down some ploppable pavement there, just to really mark out the area, and also that ploppable pavement should export nicely. And it gives me a bit of a blank canvas then, so that I can put down some buildings and start blocking out my different areas. This chimney here, what I'm doing is putting a chimney that's just there on its own. It's not going to be connected to the factory itself. It's as if the chimney is no longer working, so the flue and everything is now blocked up. And again, it's that sort of detail that then gives it the impression that this warehouse is no longer working, or this factory is no longer operating. And I had these two big warehouse structures which I wanted to kind of use there. But the key to this build, and something that I wanted to do from word go really, was that image that I had at the concept stage of the kind of collapsed roof structure. There was something about that particular image that really got me kind of hooked into doing something like that. But the question was how I was going to achieve it, because first of all, I don't think there's anything particularly on the workshop that is like that, so I couldn't use a pre-made building. And the other thing is, I kind of wanted to do something a little bit more unique. and therefore I've set about working out, starting to map out how this kind of structure, this collapsed roof structure element of the build is going to fit. And it seemed logical that it's going to be in between the two big kind of warehouse factory buildings. So the first thing is that I started to build a kind of steel structure in effect. Now I'm not actually sure whether what I'm building is a new structure that was just either they ran out of money or whatever, the factory closed before they could build it, so it was kind of left half built, or whether it's an old structure that's just falling into rack and ruin. But doesn't really matter. The end result is it's a kind of, you can see it really is just a sort of derelict structure there, slap bang in the middle of the factory complex. So I wanted this what I'm working on, this area, to really be the key kind of landmark part of the build, and the focal point, let's say, of the build. It is also the most detailed part of the project, and I was a little bit wary of adding as much detail as I did, but I think the end result, you kind of like, it does need that amount of detail, because I've got some cinematics at the end which is really, really worth staying and watching those, because the end result of doing this massive amount of work that I ended up doing on this build, I mean, it's probably taken a good 10 hours or so, just this one build, was worth it, because the cinematics at the end, I actually am pleased with those cinematics probably more than I've ever been pleased with cinematics for one of my projects. It really did just completely come together at the end. In fact, I wasn't even sure, to be honest, all the way through whether this was going to work, what I'm doing here. But when I saw the end result on the cinematics, it was all kind of worth the time, let's say. Yeah, I discovered with City Skylines that it's actually a very, very flexible tool, in fact. And I end up doing something that probably I've certainly never done anything like this before. I've done a lot of sort of projects over the months that have been a little bit more, let's say, unusual to just city building, but actually the end result of this kind of roof warehouse collapsed structure, whatever you want to call it, it kind of inspired me to consider some other ideas for the game and how I could use the game on some potentially new projects. I'm not going to be going into that now, but it's just something that has got me it's really kind of whetted my appetite. It's shown me that actually the game is a lot more flexible than I think you can give it credit for, to be honest. It can do a lot more than you expect, let's say. So this build in particular, I would say, has probably been the most rewarding build of all of the builds that I've done. Certainly a guest build, but also just from my own sort of work. I really, really did enjoy this build. And although at times it might look a bit laborious, all this kind of setting out of steel and wood and stuff, it was actually an immensely enjoyable build. So I have to first of all just thank Stegar, who actually asked me if I'd want to do this. It was very good of him to offer that, and I hope that the abandoned factory is something that will fit in Fairview in a good way, and I hope it does. I try to stick within the sort of confines of the brief, let's say, and also use assets that I hope will kind of marry in with Stegar's city. And also just it's good to do these kind of guest builds sometimes. It's good to do something a little bit different, because otherwise you can get a bit bogged down in your own work sometimes, and it does free up your energy, and it gives you a bit more sort of motivation to try other stuff and new stuff. So doing a guest build is often a really, really good way to just explore a few different options and do something a bit different. something a bit more unique. And as I say, it does give you, well, for me, it's given me lots and lots of ideas for potentially new projects, let's say. But anyway, enough of me rambling on about stuff. Let's just have a look at the build and how it's going. So obviously I've got these big buildings, and I'm trying as much as I can to make it look like this is no longer functioning as a working building, and I'm using these little timber props to give it the appearance that the doors are all kind of boarded up and so forth. In fact, I did download some plywood sheets which I was going to put over the windows, but I ended up deciding against that just because I thought the amount of props I was using was already a lot, and that was just going to probably finish it off to some extent. But I am using quite a few props, as you can see, and this is just to give the impression that the roof structure there is all kind of collapsed and fallen in. I've done a lot of this, just adding in these kind of timber sections over the floor and scattered around to, as I say, just give it the appearance that the roof has caved in. And also some of these steel sections, I'm then also putting those on the floor as well. So I think it doesn't look like it's a new structure that's being built. Because that was the danger. It could almost look like it was a building under construction. It does, I think, very much look like this is now it's fallen apart, this building, which is obviously the effect that I want to get. So as I say, this area really is the kind of focal point to the build, and I probably spent a good 50%, maybe 75% of the build actually working on this area. So there's a lot of blood, sweat and tears have gone on building this horrible looking build. And it is a horrible looking build, I've got to say. It is really not a pretty build, but there is something deeply satisfying about doing, for me, doing kind of ugly stuff in the game. I find it very rewarding to build something that looks like it's falling apart and collapsed and so forth. And I don't know why. I find that in a way more interesting to build than something that's all shiny and new. But I guess that's just my twisted mind. But that's probably why I wanted to do the abandoned factory, why I was interested in the brief, just because I could see lots of potential for an interesting build. So what I'm doing here is building a little kind of flat roof structure, and I realised that I needed to build kind of a roof structure below the flat roof, because there's elements of the flat roof that have kind of broken apart and fallen down. So you're going to see the roof structure itself through that. So again, it's just giving the impression, or trying to give the impression, that this is it's a proper kind of structure that's all falling apart, and also adding bits of these flat roof elements to the floor as well. I didn't want to go overboard in terms of this kind of structure here, but I have made it look like it's a kind of, I guess it is almost like an under construction part of the warehouse that has just been abandoned. And I wanted to add some detail here, some stairs and things, and obviously it's a kind of concrete and steel frame structure. No idea what this is, but it just, I think, kind of sits in the middle of the build quite nicely. And the screenshots I get on the side of this building also, I think, look pretty impressive when you see the rest of the build with it. It all sort of marries and ties together quite nicely. That was something else I was a bit concerned about, just how all these various elements kind of work together. And I think everything does come together eventually, but sometimes it can be a little bit I guess a bit worrying when you're building stuff and you've got all these disparate portions and they don't seem to relate to one another. But often once you add things like decals and vegetation, trees and things like that, that also almost kind of like makes the whole thing gel together more, which is obviously what the end result, hopefully, you'll see. So just really finishing off this kind of concrete and steel structure, and then going back to adding some more detail onto the floor here, because what I wanted to try and do with this particular build was get some kind of interior views, which I've never really done before with City Skylines. I've always been using it to get kind of cityscapes and street shots and things like that, and that's really where I wanted to go a bit different with this build, to try and get some nice cinematics actually inside these buildings, these structures, because also that was something that particularly in some of the images I saw, there was a lot of interior views of kind of like abandoned factories. So I wanted to make sure I could get some nice kind of cinematics and some screenshots there. This building here is a kind of like a sub building, a little warehouse structure. I don't know what it is exactly, but again, I'm adding a few more details, not a huge amount more. I'm trying to keep that kind of collapsed roof structure element the main focus, but I felt I did need to add just a few more kind of, I guess, slightly individual structures around it, just to kind of finish off the area. Otherwise you do get big empty areas. One thing with the build, and one thing that I was quite keen to do, was to leave quite a big area empty. So in effect that gives me then a good sort of backdrop to get some nice cinematics and screenshots from. So this big area here you see in front of the main kind of factory complex, I'm actually going to leave empty. So this would be kind of like either I guess a kind of a cargo or container yard, or maybe a car lot or something like that, or possibly even where there was originally a building and maybe it's now been demolished or something like that. But I did want to leave that big area quite free. And also it just helps with the amount of props and stuff, not to go too crazy and fill up every single element. So I was very much concentrating on certain kind of parts of the build. A lot of the edge I'm focusing in on. So I'm adding trees and fences, as you can see, and some little details around the perimeter. And then I'm keeping a lot of the actual area inside the build itself fairly free of detail, and I'm going to be relying mainly on decals to give the appearance of details on those kind of big open areas. I do end up putting a few little props and things on top of these warehouse factory buildings, because I think that again just helps give it the impression that this is an abandoned factory. And also now finishing off the interior, putting in some rubbish and bits and pieces. I end up filling this area up quite a lot, and that's mainly just for the cinematics at the end. And I dare say when Stegar gets the build, he'll probably want to maybe take out some of those details, because as I say, there is quite a lot to this, but hopefully it's not going to break his game. So anyway guys, this is coming towards the end of the build. In fact, I'm pretty much getting on. I mean, I've cut this down a huge amount because, as I say, this was a good 10 hours or so, I guess, working it all out. The actual time it took me to do all of this, but as I say, I have really enjoyed this build, and the cinematics I think do show the power of City Skylines in terms of the visuals you can create with this game, and also the asset creators, the amazing assets that are now out there for us to use. I think it really is a great example of those as well, in terms of seeing how everything comes together. So guys, thanks very much for watching this video. We're pretty much coming to the end now. There is a link to Stegar's YouTube channel in my description below the video, so do check out his channel, and also social media links as well. So guys, until next time, thank you very much again for watching, and do take care, and I'll see you next time. Cheers guys.